All right, we took the first session to examine things as they unfolded in Scotland with regard to the topic of slavery and the way that Scotland had functioned both as a government and as a church body, holding on to the Westminster Confession of Faith, although there were lots of variations going on and lots of other political movements going on. And we saw the success of that without having to go to war. And I wanted to give that by way of just a kind of a preamble to the struggles that we have in the United States during some of the very similar times. Because the way the United States are going to handle these things are going to be very, very different. Let's start tonight by reminding ourselves that at the time of the American Revolution, the landscape was a wild one, but it was, in terms of organized, functioning religion, it was predominantly Presbyterian. They were the loudest voices, the most influential in politics, and so it made sense for that to be going on. But there were other groups that were on the rise as well, and early in the process as well. In 1639, Roger Williams and John Clark established Baptistic churches. That should be Baptistic churches. You know, the origin of the Baptist denomination, if you can call it that, it is really quite a mystery. No one really knows where that started or with who, but in America it started with Roger Williams and John Clark, and the Baptist churches were known, for if they had nothing else in common, they were known, of course, for their believer Baptist practices. Then the rise of Methodism, which we have learned already in the past, 1729 in Oxford, was when the Wesley brothers started meeting together, and they came up with a structure of the holy and pietistic life, the practice of life as a Christian. And it became a method that they were going to exercise, a discipleship, an accountability structure, and what started off as weekly clubs of support groups became in its own right a denomination, and the churches began to develop. And only 6 years after they started, John and Charles Wesley came over to the United States for a tour, the colonies, for a tour for the purpose of spreading Methodism in the colonies. And to go along with that, of course, was Whitefield. And remember that I said that the seeds of division in the Methodist Church occurred with Whitefield, because Whitefield was a Calvinist, but the Wesleys were Arminian, and so there was division and disagreement there. Although all three were considered Methodists in terms of their faith and their practice. All of that builds up to what we call today the First Great Awakening, which it roughly stretches from 1730 to 1743. And as I've told you before, this is really seen by many to be the theological or spiritual preamble to the Revolution. It's almost like the revival that came by way of the First Great Awakening drove people to think and to act upon their faith. This is quite a dramatized portrait of it. You've got all kinds of people responding in all kinds of ways, and you've got probably Whitefield in the middle preaching, and so it's a symbol of what the Great Awakening movement stood for: free preaching out in the open, because you remember the churches disapproved and the ministers didn't want any part of this. This was radical, and it was spontaneous, and it was uncontrolled. But the one figure that stood out as being the key figure for the First Great Awakening is His name just slipped my mind. Jonathan Edwards, thank you, Jonathan Edwards. And I've told you the story about Jonathan Edwards before. Jonathan Edwards was in Massachusetts. He had taken the church from his father-in-law and was really quite strong in bringing the Reformed faith into practice. He caused a great kerfuffle. Is that a theological term, kerfuffle? Sure. In barring people from the Lord's table. Nobody had ever been barred from the Lord's table before if they weren't professing Christians. And so that he did a lot of bold things. And we consider him, in Reformed theology, in Calvinist circles, we consider him a hero for the most part. One author even puts it this way. He says, the most ambitious attempt ever to justify Calvinism in the midst of the moral and intellectual enlightenment. Remember, the Enlightenment is going on of the 1700s. One author puts it this way. He says, we grew very tired of the bloodshed that the Reformation brought on, and we were looking, and philosophers were looking for a whole new way of thinking, and they decided to, go by reason instead of spirituality and what man could do as opposed to depending on God, and that was sweeping across the colonies as well, and it influenced the thinkers, movers and shakers of the Revolutionary War and the writers of the Constitution. Like I said, we know, in many ways, in many of his Calvinistic convictions, we hold Edwards with high esteem. He's one of the greatest theologians that the United States has ever produced in its history, and his writings are generally very attributable and encourage people to read them. But you need to know that he was influenced by some of this Enlightenment as well, and so his soteriology, his doctrine of salvation, began to show the cracks of what was going on theologically in the colonies at the time. For instance, he rejected the imputation of Christ's righteousness, that's fundamental to the Calvinistic faith, and replaced it with what was called a governmental stance. Now, I can't go into what this means, but as one author defined it, he said, God never forgave sinners unless they actually deserved it. So it's a governmental kind of forgiveness and not an individual one. It's a little bit fuzzy for us to just skip over, but we have to do that. He also held that men had a natural will to stop sinning, but were not willing to do so. So that's the open door to free will in the sinner's heart and mind to choose God, which of course is very antagonistic to Calvinistic theology. And he also downplayed original sin, that we inherit sin from Adam, that we inherit the curse of God. For Adam's sin. We carry that guilt even from before birth. And he said that was merely an identification with Adam and not a curse unto death. And of course that deals with the real definition of what total depravity is. So there were some things that kept Jonathan Edwards from being Presbyterian. There were areas that he said, I just cannot abide by the Westminster Confession. I can't buy into it. I can't, swear allegiance to it. You might remember from other talks that this was the time when the Presbyterians in the United States, in the colonies, were arguing about how strict the subscription oath should be. Should we all see the same thing? Can we allow for some areas of disagreement? And these were areas that kept Jonathan Edwards from being a Presbyterian, so he became a Congregationalist, which is, again, a rather loosely defined kind of theology. Eclectic, if you will. It can mean one thing here and one thing there. But all of New England began to move toward congregationalism, kind of a mixture of Arminian theology and Reformed theology and independency, but nothing that was you could really nail down or hold to. All they knew for sure is that they were not interested in holding to the Westminster Confession in a strict form. His successor was a man named Samuel Hopkins, and Samuel Hopkins, just took the next logical step and enlarged some of the cracks that Jonathan Edwards had created. He is the one that credited for what's called New Divinity or Congregationalist theology, which is, again, a step towards the Enlightenment, a step towards man's reason, a step towards free will, ability to choose God, and to be in control of my destiny. Some of his points were man is free to choose right and wrong. That's Adam in the garden, not us. But he said he's able to choose right and wrong. All sin is overruled by God. God can determine, what that's going to be. He rejected the idea of the imputation of Adam's guilt and sin, and he was stressed. This is something that Edwards didn't do. He stressed the atonement is universal, that it is not limited. It is open to everyone, and that Christians must exercise an outward holy life. The fruit is in the demonstration of what you believe, and you can imagine the kind of issues that might come up with that. So the door is opening up even wider to just a general sense of open theology, and everybody is accepted, and no matter what you hold to and what you regard as important. The Christian Spectator wrote about this time from a Calvinist and Presbyterian perspective, saying the real question is whether New England Calvinism shall any longer be tolerated in the Presbyterian Church of this country. So even then, he was saying this is bad. This is really going. We're losing the focus that made us strong, and of course that was inherited from Scotland, which was what we talked about last week. So after the First Great Awakening happened, these other denominations, the Baptists and the Methodists, exploded on the scene. They exploded particularly up in the north and towards the west, to the center of the country. Wiki gives us a couple of comments in this regard. The First Great Awakening energized the Baptist movement, and the Baptist community experienced a very spectacular growth. Baptists became the largest Christian community in many southern states, including among the black population. Methodism spread during the First Great Awakening in colonial America. After Whitfield's death in 1770, however, American Methodism entered a more lasting Wesleyan and Arminian phase of development. So after Whitfield died, there wasn't any argument. Methodism went with free will and man-centered theology, and it grew in popularity. There wasn't a lot of worked-out theology. There wasn't a lot of developed confessionalism. It was simply preaching an evangelistic message. So the landscape is changing drastically in this period of time. You might remember when we studied Whitfield. Jonathan Witherspoon. Too many Johns and W's. When we studied Witherspoon, you remember that the nickname for the Revolutionary War was it's a Presbyterian rebellion. And that's because the Presbyterians were firmly behind it and driving it and saying this is true, this is what we should be doing, and this is God's will, and heavily influenced the thinking of even the deists who were running the political show. But As one author says, the founding fathers, many of them who were the Enlightenment deists, we're always tossing back and forth. Were the founding fathers Christian, or were they? They would mix them together. They wouldn't see a problem. They wouldn't see what your issues are. You're saying one or the other. We don't need to do that. There's so little definition. We're just blended together. But the Founding Fathers agreed with more conventional Protestant leaders that the well-being of the United States depended on virtuous citizens, and healthy churches were essential to a responsible and free public. So you could get the feel, that the best thing that the colonies can have is civility and churches. And it doesn't, the theology doesn't matter, just so people dress well and go to church. And but by the time of the Revolutionary War, as I said, it was referred to as a Presbyterian rebellion. But something you discover if you study a lot of history, and that is that the epics of war always have a negative influence on the spirituality and the morality of the people. When war is the focus, the personal choices that are made, the value of life, a whole bit, it turns us upside down. And as a result of that, the morality of the people's mindset degrades because of the influence of the awful nature that war really is. And so there's a drastic change that war brings. There's only one TV series I ever saw that brought out the true bloodthirsty nature of war as it was in the Revolutionary War. Usually Revolutionary War videos are pretty pristine and pretty clean, and it was all a good thing and everything. It was a war like any other war. There were horrors to it, and there were brutalities to it, and there were it was a vicious time, and both sides wanted to win. But the landscape began to change because of war, and after the Revolutionary War was won, the post-war faithful and tradition religion waned, kind of died on the vine, so to speak. Opportunism and business and all of the things that you get into with when the landscape changes. By 1798, Presbyterians saw such a great departure from the faith and simple purity of manners, and a visible prevailing impiety and contempt for the laws and institutions of religion, that the 1798, now that's sometime after, of course, the war, General Assembly called for a church-wide day of fasting and prayer. The conditions in the new United States were so bad, theologically, spiritually speaking, that they cried out for this kind of blessing from God to change and to revitalize the nation from within. So the Presbyterians really suffered for the war, for the work that they gave to it, and it marked a great change in their ability. But in the midst of that vacuum, the Methodists and the Baptists were already of the mindset to take great advantage of opportunity that was there. The frontier was wide open. And I remember even in seminary that they would teach us this, that the Baptists and the Methodists would make conversions. And the young man would say, "I think I'm called to the ministry," and he would say, "Go." Have you read the Bible? No, not necessarily. But you're filled with the Spirit, get on your horse and go. And so the Baptists and the Methodists would send out their guys eagerly and all over without really coming to grips on whether or not they knew what the gospel said. The Presbyterians were characterized as saying, don't go to school. And so that kind of retarded Presbyterian influence going forward after the war. And it said, you need to be educated, you need to read the confession, you need to understand what Presbyterianism is about, and then you can go. But in the meantime, you have the rise of itinerant preachers on horseback. The Methodists are going from town to town, and they're preaching to every church gathering that they possibly can. And there's no opportunity for ministering to individuals or teaching anybody in terms of basics of the faith. The only thing you can do is ride into town, climb up in the pulpit, and say, "Are you saved, brother?" And hopefully get a response. Maybe it's the same people that did it last week, but it doesn't matter. That's the only message I've got. "Are you saved, brother? You got to be saved. You're going to go to hell if you're not saved." And then they would get on their horse and they would ride on to the next place. And so it became repetitious over and over and over again. Without much depth, the whole concept of being Christian just kind of was floating out there. Presbyterians were focused on an educated ministry, and as I said, that their desire was there, their intent was there, but they wanted their ministers to know what they were talking about, and they wanted them to help people, and shepherd people as the Bible had told them to do so. But in the meantime, the Methodists and the Baptists were seeing churches pop up and growing all over. By 1801, you had the famous Cane Ridge Revival. It wasn't the first, but it was probably the most amazing revival. Revivalism began to crop up and jump up all over, and 1801, the Cane Ridge, Kentucky revival was one that was very spectacular. They had a series of preachers, and people would flock to this area, and there was all kinds of emotional caricatures of revivals, and lots of people fell down and professed faith, and it was a great emotional time. But it was also, like I said, it was also light on what it meant to be a Christian, what it meant to believe as a Christian, what it meant to understand Christianity. And as a result of this thin veneer, you had a lot of disagreement, you had a lot of misunderstanding, you didn't have a lot of unity. So, from one perspective, you could say, well, Christianity is on the rise. It's growing like crazy. But on the other hand, lives aren't changing. People are still doing what they're doing. It hasn't affected them. There isn't much change. 1801 is also the time when the challenges within the Presbyterian Church began to shake. You had the Cumberland Presbyterians break off from the Presbyterian Church because they said, your Calvinism is too harsh. We're leaning towards the revivalists. We see, look at them. They're bringing people in. What are you doing? They're converting people left and right. What are you doing? You're arguing at Presbytery. Who cares about that? You trip over. You're straining gnats. You're tied up in details. People are getting saved over here, brother. We got to do something. And your Calvinism is killing us, they would say. This idea of total depravity and everybody's going to hell and all this other stuff. We can't do that. We've got to reach out for people. And so the Cumberlands broke off. The Cumberland Synod broke off and rejected strict Calvinism. As Presbyterians, they did that. And furthermore, some of the Presbyterians up north said, let's see what we can do to build a bridge with all of these Congregationalists in New England. The Congregationalists were just like us. Maybe we can connect with them. And so Presbyterians in the north started to talk about uniting with Congregationalist churches, and they courted them and said, let's exchange pulpits, let's get together for picnics, let's talk about what we believe, and see if we can come up with a greater development. By 1811, however, the other side of Presbyterians who said, wait a minute, this is going too fast. We're losing everything we stand for and believe here. By 1811, they said something has got to change, and the General Assembly passed a motion that said we are going to start a traditional, old school type, I'm using the word too early, but fundamental, that's a wrong word too, Orthodox Westminster Confession holding to seminary. We're going to start it in Princeton, New Jersey. That's where Witherspoon will eventually wind up. And 1812 is when Princeton Seminary first started. Their first professor and only professor in the early days was Archibald Alexander, and he taught all the classes that the seminary held, and he was later joined with Samuel Miller, who was a very classic Presbyterian, and eventually a young man was brought on with lots of potential whose name was Charles Hodge. And these three would develop into Princeton Seminary's curriculum. And Princeton, even though there were other Presbyterian schools that were started by presbyteries and independently, Princeton was started by the Assembly and saw their role as holding to Westminster Confession Presbyterianism and wanting to get that across and influence the nation with it. Later on, when the war actually starts, one of the weird things about the generals in the North and in the South was that they were all trained, they all went to West Point in New York. They were all roommates and buddies at West Point, and now they were fighting against each other. That was the influence of one school over both the North and the South. Well, it will work the same way in Presbyterianism. Princeton will train Thornwell. Princeton will train all of the North theologians as well as the South theologians. And so this one school will prove to be very influential going forward. In 1818, we come back to the topic of slavery. And in 1818 is by far the most important and significant notation made or declaration made by the Presbyterian Church on the topic of slavery. And this had to do, of course, with the Westminster Confession guys, not the broader ones, but the ones who were holding the line. And they made a very strong statement against slavery. Now, let's look at what it says. Notice it says it's the voluntary enslaving one part of the human race by another was a gross violation of the most precious and sacred rights of human nature, utterly inconsistent with the law of God, which requires us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and totally irreconcilable with the spirit and principles of the gospel of Christ. Slavery created a paradox in the moral system, exhibiting rational, accountable, and immortal beings in such circumstances as scarcely to leave them the power of moral action, and as dependent on the will of others, whether they shall receive religious instructions, whether they shall know and worship the true God, whether they shall enjoy the ordinances of the gospel, whether they shall perform the duties and cherish the endearments of husbands and wives, parents and children, neighbors and friends. It's a pretty strong statement, isn't it? That's a pretty deliberately strong statement. But and I'm not picking it apart, but I want you to notice some things here before we go on. First of all, notice the way it starts. The voluntary enslaving. This is different. This is already different, they're saying, than perhaps some examples of slavery that we find in the Bible. Slaves because of war, slavery because of debt, slavery because of other circumstances in which a person might be in a position of slavery in order to work out a loan. But here they started off by very deliberately saying what's going on in the United States is clearly different than what we read in Scripture. The voluntary enslaving, not being enslaved, the voluntary capturing of people, buying people, and holding them as slaves is that voluntary enslaving he's talking about. And notice it also says the voluntary enslaving one part of the human race. Part of the discussion that's going to go on in the first half of the 19th century is this whole business that will anticipate Charles Darwin's book. Where do people's differences come from? And are we indeed from one blood? Now the Bible says we are, but can we really? How can we justify a voluntary enslaving of those that are of one relationship to us? And so that will become a big issue as the debate goes on. One part of the human race by another, utterly inconsistent with the law of God, which requires us to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's a very, that we get to the whole point of why slavery is tolerated in the South just before the war starts, and the answer is always it's economic. We need this in order to stay functioning. There's nothing about loving one another. Even the height of Thornwell's own theology on the subject, which we'll get to next week, argues that we have an obligation as masters to take care of our servants. But that sense of superiority, inferiority is something that we hold on to as just accepted. And then it goes on to the power of slavery create a paradox in the moral system, exhibiting rational, accountable, immortal beings in such circumstances as scarcely to leave them the power of moral action, and as dependent on the will of others, whether they shall receive religious instructions. You remember in Scotland? You remember what Witherspoon did? Somebody had brought this black to saving faith, and Witherspoon said, well, do I baptize him? And it caused him to have that division in his mind, He said, well, this affects him spiritually, but it doesn't affect him temporally. Where do you get that? And of course, that began to be the crack that eventually would be pursued in the courts of Scotland. And so you have the same kind of language here. Are we going to teach our slaves the Christian faith and put ourselves in that dilemma? What if they become Christians? What then? Or are we going to just keep them in the dark and not do that so that we are justified in saying that there's a difference here? So in many ways, this statement is very strong. And you can take great pride, I think, in the Presbyterian Church when they make this kind of statement. The Assembly statement, one author says, the Assembly statement conceded that the evils of slavery were not always evident. Still, the slave was deprived of his natural right, degraded as a human being, and for these reasons the Assembly advised American Presbyterians to correct the errors of former times and as speedily as possible to efface this blot on our holy religion and to obtain the complete abolition of slavery throughout Christendom and, if possible, throughout the world. Now, at this point, we take note of, remember the date, 1818. What else is going on in the world by this time? What has gone on before 1807? What's happened? Anybody remember? Wilberforce, the end of the slave trade. So remember that slavery is in evolution. Slavery is having to adjust because now the Middle Passage is illegal. And so we got to do something if we're going to keep slaves, we got to figure out another way to get them. And then 1818, and then after 1818 is 1833. What happens in 1833? Parliament bans slavery altogether. So this is right in the middle. And so and we remember what's going on in Scotland and how the Scottish Church is showing heavy influence to Parliament in all of these things. And so this is all influential to American Presbyterianism. Having denounced slavery in clear terms, though not calling it explicitly a sin, that's an observation this particular author makes. I think it comes pretty close, to tell you the truth. But the point is that also will become a big debate. Is slavery sin? Do we need to go that far? You know, that kind of thing. That a sin that deserved church discipline, the 1818 General Assembly resisted a call for immediate emancipation, immediate cessation of slavery in the United States. So the Presbyterian Church said, we're going to make this strong statement, but we're not going to go any farther at this point. We're going to see how people react to this. And let this soak in, if you will. Now, the next turn of events occurs in 1822 with the rise of Charles Finney. The so-called Second Great Awakening is a product of those early rumbling revivals that were boiling up, the Cane Ridge revival and the other revivals. They've started as early as 1790s. I forgot the 7. The 1790s, these revivals are already starting to bubble up, and people are already calling this a phenomenon similar to the First Awakening. And so Finney actually comes to the game in the Second Great Awakening a little late. And he also comes onto the scene as a Presbyterian. And that's why I bring him up. He came under care of Presbytery in St. Lawrence. He did not go to seminary. He was already an aggressive evangelist from that point. He said, I don't need seminary. And in fact, he would say, going to seminary is stupid. Later on in life, he would say, I wouldn't send anybody to seminary. Just send him on. He agreed with the Methodists and the Baptists in aggressively pursuing the souls of people. One author describes his appearance before Presbytery, and knowing how I went through this and how I've seen others go through this just puts chills up and down my back. I can imagine he actually survived, which tells you perhaps a little bit about the kind of depth that Presbyterianism was at the time. When examined for licensure by Presbytery and asked if he received the Westminster Confession, remember the language, adopting the subscription language was something that was really testily argued. Finney responded he'd never examined it with any attention, but did receive it for the substance of doctrine so far as I understand it. When I got on the floor at Presbytery, they asked me the question, do you have any exceptions with the Westminster Confession? And I jumped at the answer and I said, none to speak of. That was the wrong thing to say.
What are the ones you're not talking
I was on the floor for another half an hour trying to convince them that I meant nothing. And for him to say, well, as far as I've read it, I can't imagine. It just blows my mind to think that he could say that and be accepted. He was accepted. To be fair, Finney's instructor, his mentor, even though he had been a Princeton seminary student, that was his mentor had not thought, I like the way this author puts it, perhaps that's as far as it went, to expose his pupil to the theology of the Westminster Standards. In fact, Gale's own theological convictions sided more with revival-inspired new divinity. He was already on board, and so he had no use for this stuff either. He went through Princeton Seminary, said, "We can do without this. You don't need all that. We're fine." Then who was more persuaded with that than the scholastic theology of Archibald Alexander in the classroom of Princeton. So Finney, who starts off as a Presbyterian, he's unabashed. He says, I'm going to believe what I want to believe, and who are you to tell me any different? He begins his famous, very aggressive crusades in western New York, primarily. And he does so in an in-your-face fashion. Remember, Whitefield would go from town to town, and he would ask the ministers if he could preach in their pulpits, and they would say, "No, I don't think so, thank you very much." And so that's why all the pictures and drawings of him are in the open fields. He's preaching in the open fields to the people that gather. That's why he's out there. Finney went a step farther. He didn't care what the ministers locally felt. He would show up unannounced. He would set up his own shop. The tents would become later. He would set up his own thing. He would start preaching in fearsome tones. He would call out the local ministers by name and be suggesting very strongly that they were not saved. He did a lot of innovative things to try to get people's attention. He said, as soon as you choose Christ, you're immediately in the church membership. Didn't ask the elders of the churches, just said, "You're in." And he did another very controversial thing, of course, which seems like it's always controversial, perennial and controversial, and that is he would bring in female speakers to preach as well. His systematic doctrine, which he published later at Oberlin, and which I've read, is scathing, to say the least. It's quite an indictment against the man from a Presbyterian and confessional point of view. His own words are such that it condemns the man. It really does. He says, "Man's constitution is not morally depraved. The imputation of Adam's sin is fiction. You don't inherit anything that you have to be ashamed about. Man is fully capable of willing repentance, believing in Jesus, and making a change in his own life. It is not a work of the Spirit. It is your decision. You do it in the reason of your own thinking. You choose it. God has nothing to do with it. You're choosing God. Christ's atonement paid for all mankind. The wide open door. Everybody can come in. There's no issue about election or anything like that. The Holy Spirit is not involved in conversion. Only man's reason. Revival is a scientific exercise." Charles Hodge, up at Princeton, when he reads Finney's systematic theology, will say this man is just simply a complete Pelagian, which is an ancient heresy of the church that has been thought of before, and there's nothing new in that regard. Finney, my big gripe with Finney is that he redefined the word church and virtually destroyed it. He said the church is not the gathering of the saints for their edification, for their teaching, for their encouragement, for their strengthening. The church is a platform. It's a stage where unbelievers can come in and be saved. That's the church. And so he redefined the whole concept of what church was. And in the midst of that, again, to stay very eager, very cutting edge, and very involved, one of the things that was becoming very popular in revivalism was starting to work on morality. You had to have something to attack. You had to have something to say because sin was not your problem. Sinful things are your problem. And so morality became dominant in the voice of Finney, but as well as others. He began to talk about the evils of drink. You might remember Billy Sunday later on, another Presbyterian, would be famous for his dramatic stage choreography, where he would carry on and talk about the evils of the bottle and how Satan is in the bottom of the bottle and all of this other stuff. You're not the sin. Sin is not in you. Sin is in there. And you need to separate yourself from that, and you need to get completely away from that. And so temperance became a very easy thing to preach about. Education was also very popular. Want to educate your kids. He was on top of that because lots of the kids in these days had no schooling. Sunday schools were along the same lines as general education. Lord's Day observance. This comes real close to my passions here. I would love to get on board with that, but it's the same kind of morality. It's not the gospel. It's you need to observe the Lord's Day because it's a moral thing to do. And so they would organize Lord's Day societies and print tracts and try to bully you into observing the Lord's Day. Missions, we can never send out enough missions, Bible and tract distribution, prison reform, and finally, abolition. The scene and the mood was right to start preaching down slavery. And Finney and other revivalists were the very first to come right out and say, slavery is sin, and we need to get rid of it. So it wasn't emancipation like the 1818 statement from the General Assembly refrained from using the term. That was getting a little too far, but now Finney has jumped over it and he said, we got to stop it now, just period. Calling for its complete abolishment. Abolition is abolishment of slavery. Now, other preachers of the day, other popular preachers of the day were getting onto this bandwagon. They were seeing the success that Finney was having. They said, man, we got to do that. We got to get on board with some of this. We got to start talking about the issues. We'll put the gospel aside. We don't really need the gospel. We need to get people saved. And what that means is changing their habits and their routines and getting rid of alcohol and getting rid of this and doing that. And so the morality is what is most important. And so they along with all of these other things is the intensification for the call of abolition of slavery. It's just one of many that is starting to get the attention and the rise of ministers in the North because this brings in the people. This gets them all excited. This revs them up. And Lyman Beecher was one of those. There are several names I am skipping over just for purposes of brevity. But Lyman Beecher is definitely one of them. He had a church in Boston. He has a congregation. He's Congregationalist by affiliation at this point. Beecher also has a Presbyterian background. He came out of the Presbyterian church. So the Presbyterians, the thing about Presbyterians historically is they always are more influential than people think. The big stereotype about the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, for instance, is that it's this little bitty church that everybody else thinks is insignificant. And yet they come up with the most profound things and the watershed moments that change Presbyterian history in general. And they just people mock them and say, oh, they're the ones that split the hairs and strain the camels and the gnats rather. They're the ones who have the care to hammer things out that need to be hammered out. They're the forefathers of the 1818 of this statement against slavery. You know, they were the ones who bother working on these details. And somebody needs to do it if we're going to have anything at all to hold on to. So revivalists such as Finney in the 1830s begin to crusade against slavery, castigated as a sin. Lyman Beecher jumps on. He's prominent in many of those moral reforms. It's during this period of time, I'll just put in another stick. It's, you know, along with the intemperance movement, now churches are looking at their communion services. Well, we can't be serving wine. And so, you know, lo and behold, there's a guy named Welch who's figured out a way to pasteurize juice before it ferments. He makes a killing off the church. And even today, many still have that opinion. We don't want wine. We must serve grape juice. And you can thank Welch's. And he thanks you. 4 synods passed resolutions that call for the discipline of slaveholders. It says, we're going to make them pay. You're going to stay with us, we're going to make them pay. And so the arguments are starting to get heated. Now this graph is, I want to say that because of this new divinity movement and all the excitement and the things that are going on and how everybody's getting caught up in this is the reason why the denominations are growing. Remember I said it's all kind of thin veneer, not too much theological depth to it, but people are getting on board. It's just exciting. They like this. The Baptists are growing. The Methodists are growing. Both of those denominations now have passed Presbyterians. They've left us in the dust in terms of numbers. This graph, by the way, is one of the only ones I can find on this period. You notice that Presbyterians aren't even listed here. Man, I tried hard. I said, God, there's got to be one. No. Anyway, other things are also going on. Churches of Christ are starting up. The Shakers are coming out of New England. The Church of Latter-day Saints comes out of the burnt-over district that Charles Finney left from all of his crusades. The American Bible Society, you know, again, the movement of getting Bibles out to people, you know, and that morality issue. The temperance movement is a big deal. What's not on here is dispensationalism is starting to take its roots in Presbyterianism and growing fast. And other things are all kinds of variations on the theme are starting to sprout and explode into the scene here. And as a result, even though it wasn't on the graph, you know, you need to know the Presbyterian Church was growing. Not as much as others, but they were growing. And there were 50,000 members added. That was a jump from 43 to 86 presbyteries, and a jump in number of pastors from 543 to 1140. But again, you know, it's the thin veneer. It's not too much depth here. And many of these new guys, many of these new churches are the new divinity influenced, and they're swinging to the left. I'm sorry, I'll take that back. Swinging to the one side. So there's a cultural legacy that the Second Great Awakening leaves with us. The one is voluntary parachurch societies are springing up. They want to advance general education, exposure to wholesome literature, nothing wrong with that. To organize Sunday schools, missions, Bible and tract publication distribution. They want to abolish the slavery. They want to call for prison reform. It's just one, slavery was just one of many things. To press for temperance, the avoidance of alcohol. This is all just kind of summary. To press for the adherence to a general observance of the Lord's Day. All of these are just general kinds of things that are going on. Meanwhile, Lyman Beecher in Boston he started off in Litchfield, Connecticut. He was president of Lane Theological Seminary for a while. He was a leader in the Second Great Awakening. He's co-founder of the American Temperance Movement. He's a new divinity guy, ardent and anti-Catholic. Now we're picking on the Catholics. Don't trust the Catholics. Why? Well, they couldn't trust them in England, so we're not going to trust them here either. Of course, he's anti-slavery. He embraced all of Finney's new measures. He thought pressure, salvation by pressure and intimidation was a good thing. But the most important claim to fame that Lyman Beecher had were his kids. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Anybody remember her? Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book. We'll find out about that next week. Her brother was Henry Ward Beecher. We're going to find about him next week as well. His influence was in raising two very radical, very on fire children. And we're going to see what effect they give us next time. Meanwhile, Charles Hodge is in Princeton, and he is doing everything he can to hold Presbyterianism together and to fight off the new divinity and the Finney Pelagianism and all the stuff that's going on. He even goes as far as to publish his systematic theology, 3 volumes in 1873. They still use Hodge's 3 volumes in seminary today. It's excellent. It is by far the best systematic theology that's ever been written. He argued for Presbyterianism as the government prescribed in Scripture. This becomes known later as government by God's decree, and that is something that is accepted across the board in Presbyterianism. And he openly critiqued Finney. Finney's idea of moral ability has not been adopted in the confession of any one denominational church in Christendom, but is expressly repudiated by them all. Doesn't matter. Finney's exciting. He has all the fun things that go on. We're gonna go with Finney. And there's even churches today that still use Finney's tactics and focus in terms of what they think church is and what the duty of the church is to be. And they get it, and they still think that this is how the church should be run. When you compare, just to get an idea so you understand, by the time of Hodge and Beecher, now there's 2 terms that are being thrown around that kind of identify the one side from the other side. The one is old school, which probably is meant to say, old, dismiss them kind of people. And the new, what was it in Men in Black? Old and busted, new hotness.
That's right.
Old and busted, new hotness. That's kind of how this was characterized, old school, new school. The old school Presbyterians called for a return to traditional Calvinism and the Westminster Confession of Faith. The Westminster Confession of Faith continues to be the finest doctrinal summation that the church has ever written. And it is not something that we are at liberty to just dismiss if we want on this bit and that bit and the other bit. It deserves a study. It deserves learning. It deserves growing in your appreciation of it. But the new school embraced the new divinity. And we don't have time for all this doctrinal nonsense. And we're much more persuaded with the idea that man is able to choose God and God doesn't have to choose man. And that salvation can be universal. We preach to everybody. We're not discriminating. The old school was suspicious of revivalism because of its loose canon kind of concept, the new measures of Finney, etc. The new school desired and practiced revivalism. How else are you going to get people saved? It's a hard and compelling argument when you put it like that, to argue against. The old school called to maintain subscriptionism. We have to be united. We have to know who we are. We have to know what our unity stands for so that we can make decisions like 1818 together and stand by them. And to have a Presbyterian form of government. The new school was being led away from Presbyterianism and into Congregationalism because there's no accountability. Nobody's going to look over my shoulder and say, what are you doing? You don't have a right. You can't do that. Congregationalism is much more independent, much more self-controlling, much more self-designing. The old school united in the North would unite in the North as the war approached. The new school would become divided in the South as the war approached. Actually, the new school wasn't represented very well in the South. There were some new school, but predominantly the South was old school, a la Princeton, believe it or not. And in the old school held to passing the exscinding react, which removed, in other words, disciplining people for having slave owners in their members. And the new school drew up what was called the Auburn Declaration defending their views. So we're starting to see polarization in the Presbyterian Church. It had been there for a long time. Now it's becoming very, very problematic. It affects everything. It affects who you're going to have lunch with. It affects who you can talk to. It's kind of like Republicans and Democrats right now. Oh, you're one of them. Forget it. I don't want to. And you're either old school or new school, and it affects everything. 1818 was that first firm stand by Presbyterians against slavery. Then you get to as far as 1845. Now, we're still 10 years away, or 20 years away from the war. The 1845 assembly was divided, and it was divided over the issue of slavery. The new school said slavery is a decisive issue. It is a moral crusade. We need to get rid of it. They were abolitionists to the core. The old school was more towards preserving the nation as the primary issue. We need to keep the nation together. We can work this out. They did it in Scotland. We can do it here. That kind of thing. On one hand, now they begin to talk about exegetical differences. Well, on one hand, slavery isn't actually renounced in the Scriptures. Show me the chapter and verse that says slavery is sin. It's not there. So maybe under certain circumstances, slavery is okay. On the other hand, the evil connected with slavery must not be countenanced. That's as close as they can get to beating slaves and to starving slaves and to chopping off hands and raping slaves and all of the things that went on in the slave markets. They only can come as close as evil connected to slavery must not be countenanced. How far have the Presbyterians come from 1818 to 1845? It's a sad statement. It really is. 1831, the Presbyterians begin to polarize between the new divinity and the Calvinists. By 1835, the polarization becomes antagonism. 1826, there were those stats I gave you. Lyman Beecher, a popular minister in New England, was charged because of his new divinity theology and his practices. Finney walks out of Presbyterianism at this point, and he says, I don't care about you guys anymore. Nuts to you. Good riddance to my former Presbyterian peers. Albert Barnes. Anybody ever heard of Albert Barnes? Albert Barnes' commentaries are in almost every minister's library. He's a very well-known theologian, Presbyterian in our history, and yet he was put to trial again and again and again and again and again for his views. And he is tried and suspended because of his new school teaching. You can look into that yourself. But he's later acquitted out of the fear of growing tensions between the two sides. So even Albert Barnes' situation, that's a whole story in itself. And you might be interested in reading about that. Finally, in 1838, now we're still years away from the war. But in 1838, the split between the old school and new school Presbyterians becomes formal. One man has written, there are good arguments to support the claim that the split in the churches was not only the first break between the sections, that's what they called the North and the South in those days, the sections. You were in the North section or the South section, between the sections, but the chief cause of the final break. Do you see what that's saying? You say Christianity, Christians, being Christian, going to church meant so much more in those days than it does in our secular society. And this author is saying, with this split, he already sees bad things on the horizon for this whole entire country. The country depends on the church as the moral compass. And if the church is going to argue and split over these things, there's no hope for us. We're lost. A. Nevins, in his comprehensive account of the Civil War, stated much the same thing, that the divided churches had contributed significantly to the political estrangement. You know, what churches do matters. And this last author, Cheeseborough, says, I tell you, this sundering of religious ties which have hitherto bound our people together, I consider the greatest source of danger to our country. If our religious men cannot live together in peace, what can be expected of us politicians? I love this line. What can be expected of us politicians, very few of whom profess to be governed by any great principles of love? What an amazingly honest confession that is, you know. What about us crooks? It's just stunning. I laughed out loud when I read that. But he says we depend on our ministers and we depend on the churches to hold this nation together. And they're splitting apart. What is that going to do to us? And you remember, the Presbyterians were now outnumbered, outpaced by Baptists and Methodists in terms of numbers in churches. But before the war would start, both of them, Baptists and Methodists, would also split apart in much the same ways. And as goes the church, goes the nation. This is the Presbyterian family tree. And I always like to point out that, yeah, there's lots of splits in the history of the Presbyterian Church, but if you look closely, you also see lots of reunions, and we are to be credited for that. The section that we're talking about right now is here, the old school and the new school split that lasts until after the war, when all of a sudden we realize we need to stay together. But it's after the war that they learned that lesson. In the meantime, you notice here's the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, 1810. They branch off and go their own separate way. But the old school and new school split really set the tone for the nation going forward. And so next week we're gonna pick it up from there and see how the topic and the issue of exegesis really becomes a big problem. What does the Bible actually say about slavery? Does it accept it? Does it say we can live with it? Or does it forbid it? Now that there are so many voices and the churches themselves have split over this issue, who are we going to listen to? And how is it going to make a difference in our lives? Who's going to win? That's where we left it. Okay. Questions or reactions? Comments? Oh, boy. Yeah. I don't remember right offhand during this period. Scott, that's a good question. Whether there were any Presbyterians who were presidents during the time. I do not know the answer to that. I don't come across them as influential, so whether they were there or not, I don't know. Yes, Nick?
It's just kind of for the future, but that Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States, the moderator of that, or the stated clerk of that entire assembly is Wilson, J. Ruggles Wilson, who is
Woodrow's.
President Woodrow
Yeah.
Wilson's father.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. That's a good point. We'll keep him. Anybody else? All right. Yeah. Silas?
Huge, like the chart you're showing with all the growing church attendance.
Right.
Where are all those people coming from? Were they coming from, like, what denominations, or was it just population growth?
It was population growth. It was movement west. And it was also the decline in church attendance and spirituality after the Revolutionary War. They were revitalizing all of that, and we were gaining them all over again. Yeah.